love adventure. I've traveled to nearly all 50 states, experiencing the diversity of both nature and people. The main reason I travel is to explore the wilderness. Sometimes I go backpacking in the Rocky Mountains. Other times I drive through national parks or across the desert. Growing up on the East Coast, I never had many chances to experience the desert, so I preferred driving through it rather than the mountains. I've been doing this for years, and I've never encountered anything too strange in the desert, aside from the overwhelming sense of solitude. My favorite time to drive through the desert is at night. The stars shine brilliantly across the landscape. However, about a month ago, I saw more than just sand and stars on a particular trip. I was driving through the Arizona desert as the sun began to set. For me, it was one of the most breathtaking moments. Desert sunsets transport me to a completely different place. Sometimes I even camp in my car because, in a way, I enjoy the solitude of being out there. Normally, I bring my dog along, but my parents were in town, so this time, I was alone. As night fell, I debated whether to camp or keep driving home. My parents were expecting me, and I was only about an hour away, so I decided to continue my journey through the darkening desert. If you've ever driven through the Arizona desert, you know that occasionally you'll see horses or other animals along the roadside, so spotting figures standing near the road isn't entirely unusual. About 45 minutes from home, my headlights illuminated a different shape. It looked like a person. Being the kind of person who doesn't hesitate to help, I pulled over to see if they were all right. As I got closer, I noticed the person wasn't moving. They sat completely still, seemingly unaware of my presence. Their head never turned, never acknowledged me. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out. No response, no reaction. The man looked disheveled, quite pale, but strangely he was clean-shaven. Despite that, he was disturbingly thin. The longer I observed him, the more unnatural his thinness seemed. Something about him unsettled me. I had been watching him from my car, and as I leaned out the window, I noticed his jaw move slightly. "I need some water," he said. His voice was deep, inhumanly deep. I can't explain why, but it sounded wrong. "All right, man. Let me grab some from my car," I replied. I walked over to the passenger side to grab a bottle of water. Before I could reach it, though, a feeling of dread washed over me. Something wasn't right. I turned back and the man was gone. My stomach dropped. I had no idea where he had disappeared to. I quickly shut the passenger door and scanned the area. That's when I heard movement behind a large rock about 10 to 20 feet off the road. Another man stepped out from behind it. But this wasn't the same man. This guy looked absolutely deranged. He was clutching something in his hand. Then, without hesitation, he started running toward me. I didn't think. I just reacted. I jumped into my car and slammed on the gas. As I sped away, I glanced in my rearview mirror and my blood ran cold. More people. 5 or 6 of them. They emerged from behind the rocks near the road, all watching me as I accelerated. I had no intention of stopping. In fact, I would have been relieved if the police had pulled me over at that moment. 3 or 4 minutes later, I felt calm enough to turn on some music. I took one last look in my rearview mirror, and my stomach dropped. The man I had given water to was sitting in my back seat, just staring, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking through me. I slammed the brakes, too shocked to make a sound. I couldn't take my eyes off him. Then he smiled. The expression of death was painted across his face. "You'll soon be one of us," he whispered, lifting a knife. I scrambled out of the car, heart pounding. As soon as I did, I heard the back door open. He was fast, unnaturally fast. I knew I couldn't outrun him for long. "Are you ready?" That deep voice called out as he closed in. By now, the desert was completely dark. I had no idea where to go. I thought it was over. Then headlights appeared in the distance. I was several hundred feet from my car, but I waved desperately at the approaching vehicle. Thank God the driver saw me and stopped. I quickly explained what had happened. He tried calling the police, but there was no signal. His name was Mark, and he agreed to follow me home in case anything else happened. He also had a handgun, which made me feel much safer. After about 35 minutes of driving with Mark following closely behind, I finally made it home. I thanked him and checked my backseat to see if anything was missing, or if the man had left something behind. Everything was still there. But then I noticed a piece of paper resting on top of my backpack. I picked it up and unfolded it. "You are not safe. You will soon be one of us." A chill ran down my spine. I jumped when I heard footsteps in front of my car. It was just my mom standing there. My dog, however, was throwing up violently. I didn't say anything. I knew my parents wouldn't believe me. I decided I would call the police once they went to bed. "Oh yeah, some guy stopped by looking for you about 20 minutes ago," my mom mentioned casually. I froze. I asked what he looked like. "Oh, just a skinny guy with a really deep voice," she said. "He didn't say much, but he left a letter for you." My heart nearly stopped. I opened it, hands trembling. "We know where you live." My stomach dropped. After calling the police and explaining everything, they conducted an investigation, but they never found any sign of those people along the route I had driven. I gave them the letters for DNA testing, but I haven't heard anything back yet. I installed a security system in my home and haven't had any issues since. I just hope it stays that way. So my truck route takes me from here in Connecticut all the way down to Kentucky and Tennessee. It's a pretty good stretch, and I get to see most of the beautiful scenery the East Coast has to offer. But there's one part of the country that always feels a little wilder than the rest: the area around the Appalachian Mountains. As you may know, it's one of the poorest regions in the country, a place that was truly devastated when the coal industry declined and the local economy collapsed. It's heartbreaking to see some of these families struggling with such deep poverty. One day I had to drive through a part of the state I'd never been to before because my usual highway route was blocked due to a massive accident, one that unfortunately resulted in fatalities. My truck had some trouble navigating the roads after my phone died, and wouldn't you know it, my plug-in charger decided to fail at the worst possible time. But I'm an experienced truck driver, and I wasn't in my 18-wheeler for this particular trip, so I was able to take some smaller roads to find my way. Still, even though I consider myself pretty good at handling the road, there came a point where I realized I was completely lost, and I started to worry that I wouldn't make my delivery on time. Missing a deadline meant disciplinary action and all that nonsense, and I couldn't afford that. So when I saw a guy wandering on the side of the road, I slowed my truck, rolled down the window, and asked him for directions. He seemed friendly enough and was happy to take a few minutes to give me all the information I needed to get back to the main highway heading south. But then I asked if there was anywhere nearby where I could grab some lunch. It was getting close to 1 p.m. and I'd only managed a pretty meager breakfast that morning. The guy scratched his head and took an oddly long time to come up with an answer. Normally in West Virginia, it doesn't take more than a few seconds to name a spot with biscuits and gravy within a couple of miles. So why was he struggling to think of one? It didn't make sense. When I asked again, he finally told me about a family-owned place that supposedly had the best country fried steak in the whole county, maybe even the whole state. Suddenly all was forgiven. I may be a northerner, but I'd be damned if I turned down a good country fried steak. It took him a while because he was trying to figure out the best way to send me there without leading me onto some washed-out dirt road that might leave my truck stuck. That really would have been a disaster. After a minute, he gave me some fairly detailed directions to an old shopping center. He told me it was mostly abandoned, but that the restaurant was still there, along with a few other small businesses. He said not to worry if the place looked quiet at lunchtime because most of their business happened in the early morning and late evening. I thanked the guy and headed off. It took a little while, but I eventually found the old shopping center
he had mentioned.
To be honest, driving past a few chain restaurants was a little frustrating since I was starving, but if I was going to get home-style cooking from a family-run place, I figured it would be worth it. When I finally pulled up to the shopping center, though I saw exactly why it was in such rough shape, it was way off the beaten path with no signage, no advertisements, nothing to even let people know it was there. But what was worse, I didn't see any sign of a restaurant being open in any of the units. I wasn't about to give up that easily, though. I spotted a place with an old, faded sign that said something like, Mama J's Country Kitchen, or something similar, so I got my hopes up. Then I saw a man step out into the afternoon heat and stared directly at my truck. I gave him a friendly nod, excited that I was finally about to get some good food on this long, lonely drive from Connecticut. I figured maybe he didn't see me, not because of the sunlight or something, but he just kept staring at me. Anyway, I got out of my truck, locked the door, and started walking toward the restaurant. When I was halfway across the parking lot, I called out and asked if they were still open for business. The guy didn't respond. He just kept staring at me in a way that I now realize was anything but welcoming. Something in my gut told me to stop. I felt a chill run through my body, like something was screaming at me that this whole situation was wrong. Suddenly, I felt incredibly exposed. Then the guy reached behind his back and pulled something from his pocket. At first, I thought it was a beanie, but then he yanked it down over his face like a ski mask. That's when I noticed something else in his hand, a small handgun. I turned and ran for my truck. As I did, I saw a few more people emerge from the abandoned units, all rushing toward my truck to block me in. Each of them had some kind of weapon, knives, metal pipes, something. That only made me run faster. Thank God for my instincts. If I had hesitated even a second longer, they would have reached my truck before I did. I threw the door open, jumped inside, and locked the cab behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys while they pounded on the truck with their weapons, shouting for me to get out. Then the guy with the gun raised it, aimed right at my face through the windshield, and yelled at me to step out. Had no choice but to do what I did. I started the engine and floored it, plowing through the group. Some of them weren't quick enough to get out of the way, and I knocked a few of them down. I ducked low in my seat as I gripped the wheel, running, on pure instinct. And thank God I did, because the moment I drove toward the guy with the gun, he fired a shot. It shattered my windshield and hit the seat right where my head had been just a second earlier. I sped out of that parking lot as fast as I could, expecting another gunshot at any moment. But instead, I just saw those who had avoided my truck, chasing after me, while the ones I had hit were rolling on the pavement in pain. That was the only thing keeping me from losing my mind. I realized I had just barely made it out alive. I kept driving blindly in the first direction I could until I found a safe place to pull over and call the cops. The deputy I spoke with told me to head to the station when I could to give a statement, and I did, though not before finally getting some lunch. Not even a near mugging could kill my appetite. I guess that makes me sound a little gluttonous, but you have to understand how hungry I was. At the station, I learned I wasn't the first trucker to run into these guys. I was just unlucky enough to ask directions from one of their relatives, who sent me straight into their trap and then called them to let them know I'd be there. At least that's the only conclusion we could come to after I described the guy I had spoken to. The sheriff just nodded in understanding when I gave my description. I guess I'm just here to warn you all to be very, very careful on the road. And yeah, it might sound like some old cautionary tale from your aunt's Facebook post, but be mindful of who you talk to. You never really know who they are. There's a stretch of I-70 in Utah between Salina and Green River that's over 100 miles long with no services, no hotels, no restaurants, no gas stations, just a few scenic overlooks where you can pull off the road. It's a challenging drive. And don't get me wrong, the Utah mountains are stunning during the day and at night. You can see some of the clearest starry skies you'll ever find. But 100 miles is a long way, especially at night. Anyone who's driven that stretch of highway can tell you it's not exactly bustling, even during the day. When the sun sets, traffic thins out, and by midnight, you can drive for miles and miles without seeing another car's headlights. And don't even get me started on cell service out there. It's definitely not a place you want to break down, especially at night. Just the thought of being stranded out there in the dark with no one around for miles is enough to make anyone reconsider pushing through. Unfortunately for me, I was in a hurry, so I decided to keep going. A little backstory. I'm from a city called Lincoln in Nebraska, mostly known for the college sports team, the Cornhuskers. I was born and raised there, lived there until I was about 25, and then decided that since I was single and had no kids, it was time to get out and explore. So I took a job in LA and moved out west. Most of my family still lives in Lincoln, so I try to go back and visit occasionally. On this particular Sunday, I got a call from my mom around 2 p.m. My grandfather, who had been in a nursing home since having a stroke, had taken a turn for the worse. They didn't expect him to make it through the weekend, so if I wanted to see him, I needed to go sooner rather than later. Unfortunately, I had just lost my job, but that meant I had the time to make the trip. Last-minute flights were expensive, so I decided to drive. I'd done the drive before. It wasn't exactly fun, but it was a much cheaper option. I figured I'd try to power through the whole thing. Lucky for me, I'd had my car serviced a few weeks earlier. 2 hours after the call, I'd packed up my car, grabbed my dog, Max, and hit the road. The drive was fairly smooth for the most part, but most of the daylight was gone by the time I reached Utah. I remember being disappointed that I'd be driving through most of Utah and Colorado at night, missing the scenery. I love stargazing, but it's hard to enjoy the stars when you're driving 80 miles an hour. And since I was in a hurry, I wasn't going to stop for a better look. So, I settled for singing loudly to keep myself awake. We've all been there. Little after midnight, I finally reached Salina, Utah. I passed a billboard warning drivers about what was coming up. No services for the next 110 miles. The sign was paid for by the city of Salina, and that's a good thing, considering how often gas station employees have to deal with people walking in because they've run out of gas. I stopped, filled up my tank, and got back on the road immediately. There had been recent snowfall, and while the road was clear, there were still piles of snow pushed to the sides. Now I'm the kind of driver who speeds everywhere I go. The speed limit on this particular stretch of road is usually around 80 mph, so I was cruising at about 90, except for the downhill sections where I slowed down a bit. I'd been driving for about 30 minutes at this point. I'd passed a couple of cars a few miles back, but they were so far ahead now that I couldn't even see their taillights. Have you ever driven alone on a highway late at night and just been struck by how dark it is and how utterly alone you feel? Sometimes when I'm driving like that and I come to a long straight stretch, I like to turn off my headlights for a few seconds just to see what it's like with almost no light around. It's almost purifying. Suddenly, as I was driving, I heard a loud pop and the car jerked to the right. Or maybe it was the left, I don't remember. My tire pressure warning light flashed and I slammed on the brakes. After I got the car under control, I pulled over to the shoulder and turned on my hazard lights. The odds were getting crazy. I'd had a flat tire before, so I knew what to expect. When I got out of the car, the front right tire was completely flat. I tried to inspect the tire more closely to see what had actually happened, but even with the flashlight on my iPhone, it was too dark to see much. I checked my phone, and of course there was no cell service. I rolled down the back passenger window so Max could stick his head out and get some fresh air while I changed the tire. I started working, muttering under my breath about how, of course, I was only halfway to Green River and would have to drive the rest of the way on a spare, which would slow me down significantly. I got the spare tire and jack out of the trunk and was about to start when I froze. Someone was walking toward me, their shadow barely visible at the edge of my headlights. They made no sound as they approached, just kept walking until they were about 30 feet from my car. I couldn't make out any features. They were just a tall figure, maybe 6'5" or 6'6". At this point, no cars had passed me heading east since I'd pulled over, so after the initial shock of seeing another person, my first thought was, where did this person come from? They just stood there, motionless, staring at us. Max, who usually barks at anything that moves, was completely silent, just staring at the figure like he was as confused as I was. I won't lie. I was terrified. Who was this person? Where had they come from? And why were they just staring at me? Why wasn't Max barking at them like he did at everything else? I set the spare tire down and hesitantly called out, "Hello?" I was still hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me. There was no response. They didn't move a muscle. It was below 10 degrees and they weren't even shivering. I called out again, louder this time. Still no response. By now I was starting to wonder if this person needed help more than I did. I opened my mouth to speak again when I finally heard something. "Do you need help?" the figure asked weakly. It was the first time I could tell it was a man based on his voice. His voice wasn't as deep as you'd expect from someone his size, which struck me as odd, but he still didn't move. "Where did you come from?" I asked. I hadn't seen any taillights ahead of me, and no one had passed me since I'd pulled over. "How long have you been out here?" I started moving slowly toward the front of my car, the tire iron still clutched in my hand. The man didn't move, but he spoke again. "Do you need help?" I stopped and tried to get a better look. I still couldn't make out any distinct features, but I could tell he wasn't dressed for the weather. I was wearing sweatpants and a winter coat and was still freezing, but here was this man in a short-sleeved shirt. He kept his head down the entire time. By now, I was really starting to panic. "Do you need help?" I asked again, my voice louder, this time. His response was delayed, and when he finally spoke, his voice sounded off, like he was struggling with each word. "Do you need help?" he repeated, his tone becoming more urgent. He started walking toward me, still repeating the phrase, "Do you need help?" over and over, faster now. I quickly moved around the car, heading for the driver's side door. Just as I was about to open it, a pair of headlights appeared behind me. Instinctively, I turned and saw a car approaching on the highway. Max started, barking loudly. I turned back, expecting to see the man closing in on me, but he was gone. Max was still barking, but there was nothing. No movement, no breathing, no response. I stood there for a few seconds trying to process what had just happened. The car on the highway passed me without stopping. I couldn't blame them. Would you stop for a random car on the side of a deserted road? I didn't even think to wave them down. I was still trying to make sense of everything. Had I imagined the whole thing? I walked forward to where the man had been standing. There were footprints in the snow. They started where the man had been standing and led away from the road, disappearing into the darkness. I still had the tire iron in my hand. I turned on my phone's flashlight and followed the footprints. They went about 10 feet before turning and heading south away from the road. I wasn't foolish enough to follow them into the Utah wilderness in the middle of the night, but damn, I was curious. The Headlights from the passing car snapped me back to reality. I returned to my car, changed the tire, and got back on the road, though at a much slower pace. The rest of the drive was uneventful, and I didn't feel the need to mention the encounter to anyone. Sure, it was weird, but I wasn't entirely convinced. I hadn't imagined the whole thing. It was late, and I'd been driving for nearly 9 hours straight. But I'll tell you one thing. I definitely didn't want to drive that stretch of road again to find out. A few years ago, one of my closest friends moved away with his longtime girlfriend for a job opportunity he couldn't turn down. The only issue was that he didn't want to fly his dogs with him because they would have to stay in a hotel for the first month. He was also hesitant about putting them on a plane due to health concerns for both pets. Once he had secured a rental house, he missed his furry companions and asked his sister, another close friend, and me to drive them to him. We were in Chicago, so the trip would be long. However, with 3 of us splitting nearly 30 hours of driving, it would be manageable. We set off early, driving for long stretches at a time. My friend and I decided we would handle most of the driving, and if necessary, his sister would take a turn. Due to an issue with his lease agreement, we were on a tight schedule and couldn't afford to stop for more than 8 hours at a La Quinta in Denver. The journey was smooth for the most part, except for a police stop right before entering Utah. Apparently, we had driven 2 miles in the left lane on an empty highway. After that, we passed through Utah, Arizona, and Nevada without much trouble, until we hit California and needed gas. I had been driving most of the first day and switched with my friend after the police stop. I sat in the passenger seat as the navigator, keeping an eye on the GPS for gas stations. We were always looking for road signs. That's when we spotted a sign for some ghost town called Yerimo or something similar. There was a mobile gas station, which was great because it wasn't right off the highway. We pulled in, low on fuel. Normally, we would let the dogs out at every stop, but since we had stopped not long before and both dogs were sound asleep in the back, I decided to fuel up without anyone else leaving the car. My friend parked opposite an old beat-up green car, and a short, heavy-set man had just stepped out to head toward the store. I noticed a few other vehicles parked near the station, likely belonging to employees, and a couple of cars at the pumps, but no visible people. Nothing seemed unusual until I swiped my credit card. The first swipe was declined. I figured it was a bad read and tried again. This time the pump displayed, "Please see cashier." Annoyed but needing gas, I knocked on my friend's window, told him what was happening, and asked if anyone needed anything. After getting requests for a Gatorade and a pack of Marble Reds, I walked toward the store. Right away, something felt off. The station was eerily quiet, especially for one right off the highway. As I stepped inside, I noticed something even stranger. Several boxes of chips were scattered on the floor as if someone had been stocking shelves and abruptly stopped. Turning to my right, I realized there was no one inside. With 6 cars outside, I should have seen at least one person. Then I thought of the man at the pump next to me. Where had he gone? It was unlikely that everyone was in the bathroom at the same time. That's when my gut started twisting. Something was wrong. I've always trusted my instincts, and at that moment they were screaming at me to get out. I wanted to run, but knew that would look suspicious. I decided to stay calm and act naturally. In my head, I had only been in the store for a few minutes, but as I turned to leave, I hesitated for a second to listen. Any sound at all would have been reassuring. A toilet flushing, the hum of a refrigerator, anything. But there was nothing. As I stepped outside and saw my car, dread hit me hard, like that moment in a horror movie when the hero thinks they've made it, only for the music to cut out before something terrible happens. I was about 25 yards from the car when a man emerged from the opposite side of the store. He was not the man I had seen at the pump earlier. He was taller with an unnerving expression. The best way I can describe it is like Nicolas Cage's unsettling grin in Face Off right before things get violent. I kept walking toward my car, but when I glanced back, he was now walking toward me with intent. At that moment, I picked up the pace. Of course, my friend, being an absolute idiot, had locked the doors. To make matters worse, our 95-pound golden retriever was sprawled across my seat. Clearly, my companions hadn't realized how panicked I was, or that the creepy guy was still approaching. I pounded on the window and yelled for them to unlock the damn car. Instead of doing so, my friend rolled down the window halfway to tell me he was afraid the dog would jump out if he opened the door. I reached in and shoved the dog into the back seat as hard as I could, while my friend, now registering my fear, fumbled to start the car. As we sped off, I glanced back one last time. The creepy man had stopped, now standing by one of the gas pumps, still wearing that same unsettling grin. We found another gas station down the road, this time with plenty of people around. After scaring my friends with the story while filling up, we got back on the highway. Unfortunately, that meant driving past the station again. It had been about 15 minutes since we left. As we approached, the station looked exactly the same. The same cars were still parked in the same spots. After several miles of panicked silence, my phone rang. It was my credit card company. They wanted to confirm a $100 charge at a mobile station. The woman on the phone was incredibly helpful in handling the situation, but was just as unsettled as I was when I explained what had happened. Eventually, we made it to LA and had an amazing trip. But even now, I can't shake the eerie feeling about that little gas station off the highway, or the grinning man who watched me leave. Last year, my husband and I decided to clean out the attic in our 2-story house, a task that was long overdue. Neither of us had been up there in over a year. The attic wasn't very big, and we didn't use it, but we had stored some things there over the years. Finally, we agreed that the space could be put to better use. One Saturday morning, we both went up to take a look inside. There were a few boxes and some old furniture, but it wasn't as bad as we had expected. We grabbed a couple of boxes and carried them downstairs. I told my husband to go through one of them since most of the things inside belonged to him. Then, I went back up to get more. As I returned to the attic, I picked up a few more boxes, but just as I was about to leave, I thought I heard a noise coming from the far corner. I turned to look, but I didn't see anything. Still, I felt uneasy and quickly ran down the stairs. My husband noticed my reaction and asked what was wrong. I told him I had heard something up there. We decided to go back up together to investigate. Everything seemed normal, and I walked toward the corner where I had heard the noise, with my husband following behind. But just as we reached the spot, we suddenly heard a sound right behind us, by the attic door. We spun around at the same time and saw the attic door slam shut. It happened so fast that I didn't see who, if anyone, had closed it. But now, we were trapped. My husband and I stared at each other in shock. "Who just did that?" he asked. He went to open the door, but the doorknob had been broken from the inside. We both tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. It seemed impossible to open without the knob. Then we heard some movement from the rest of the house. That was the scariest part. Luckily, we had our phones with us, so I quickly called the police. Meanwhile, my husband pushed a piece of heavy furniture against the door, hoping that whoever was in our house wouldn't be able to come back up to where we were. I explained the situation to the police, and they said they would arrive soon. While we waited, we listened carefully for any more noises from inside the house, but everything had gone eerily silent. We also looked around the attic, but there was no sign that anyone had been there at all. A few minutes later, we saw through the window that the police had arrived in our driveway. We waved at them and they entered the house. When they finally managed to open the attic door for us, they told us that whoever had been inside was already gone. The back door had been left open, but nothing seemed to be missing or disturbed. This unsettled me even more. We managed to finish cleaning the attic and replace the doorknob in the following days, but we never figured out how that person got into the attic in the first place, or what they wanted. What scared me the most was that they knew exactly how to remove the doorknob, leaving us trapped inside. This story took place last spring. As I did every year, I was cleaning up the house as soon as the weather warmed up. I organized my belongings and planned a big yard sale. I sorted through many items around the house, set them aside for selling, and began moving boxes outside. It was a beautiful day, perfect for setting up. As I arranged everything, I decided on the pricing for my outdoor sale. That day, I was working alone and had already organized a large number of items. There were plenty of boxes scattered outside. After a few hours of cleaning, I was heading toward my driveway to place a few more things when I noticed a man walking up my driveway toward my garage. We had a detached garage, and at that moment, the garage door was open. I didn't recognize the man at all. It was quite unusual for something like this to happen, so I called out to him and asked what he was doing. But he didn't respond. He just kept walking straight into my garage. At this point, I felt a bit uneasy because we had tools and other valuable items stored there. He could be trying to steal something, or worse, he might use something as a weapon. Still, I decided to follow him, hoping he had just mistaken my house for someone else's. As I stepped into the garage, I couldn't see him anywhere. I walked around, but it wasn't a large space, just a single-car garage. We didn't have a car in there at the time, so there weren't many places to hide. I circled around twice, but the man was nowhere to be found. The only other exit besides the main garage door was a back door, but it was blocked by some old trash bins. I couldn't understand how he had vanished like that. A chill ran down my spine, and I decided to take the boxes back inside. I continued organizing my things as usual, preparing for the yard sale the next day. The following day, I set up the sale with part of it in the garage and the rest in the driveway. I sat at a table in the middle of the driveway with a small cash register. Soon, people started arriving and everything was going smoothly. Then, one of the shoppers came up to me. She looked uneasy and said there was a creepy man hiding inside one of the trash bins in the garage. My stomach dropped. Feeling braver since there were people around, I walked over to check. When I opened the trash bin, I saw the same man from the day before. He didn't look at me, he just suddenly leaped out aggressively and ran away. Everyone who saw it seemed completely shocked. I felt relieved that he didn't cause any major trouble, but the thought of him possibly staying in my garage for days sent a shiver down my spine. A few years ago, I was cleaning out my house. I had rented a place for a year, and with that year coming to an end, I knew it was time to start packing up and moving my belongings to my new place. The house I lived in at the time was quite small, but it had enough space for just me. I lived alone. I had just finished tidying up the living room, leaving only some basic furniture behind, and I moved on to cleaning the kitchen. There were quite a few cabinets, and I realized that I hadn't used many of them. As I went through the ones I rarely opened, I wanted to make sure there was nothing I had forgotten about. In one of them, tucked away in the back corner, I noticed what looked like an old shirt or rag. When I picked it up, I immediately realized it wasn't mine. But as I moved it aside, I uncovered a small white lever that was almost impossible to notice. The cabinet was positioned in the corner of the kitchen, partially blocked by the stove and aligned with the sink. At first, I thought it was just another pipe, but something about it looked different. Curious, I leaned inside to get a better look. The cabinet was fairly large, and when I crawled further in, I discovered a small hatch leading into the wall. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. You had to be fully inside the cabinet to even notice it. After a moment of hesitation, I decided to open the hatch. It revealed an extremely narrow passageway, barely wide enough for someone to squeeze through. As I moved deeper inside, I was horrified to find food wrappers and blankets, as if someone had been living there. The only relief was that whoever had been staying there was gone. I tried to process what I had just found. How long had this person been there? How had I not noticed anything before? I was out of the house a lot due to work and other commitments, but the idea that someone had been living in a hidden space inside my home without my knowledge was terrifying. Despite my shock, I continued cleaning until it got late. The next day after work, I decided to check the hidden passage again. I opened the cabinet, crawled inside, and pulled the lever just as I had the day before. But this time, the moment the hatch opened, I saw movement. Before I could react, I caught a glimpse of a person, just for a second before they slammed the door shut in my face. Panic surged through me. I scrambled out of the cabinet, bolted out of the house, and ran straight to my car. My hands were shaking as I called the police. I was so terrified that I started driving away while I explained everything to them. A short while later, the police arrived at my house. By the time they searched the hidden passage, the person was already gone. I never found out who they were or how long they had been living there. The only thing I knew was that I was moving out the following week, and I was beyond grateful that I wouldn't have to stay in that house any longer. Looking back, I'm relieved that nothing bad ever happened to me while I was there. But the thought of someone secretly living in my home all that time still sends chills down my spine. When they first appeared to begin this story, I was a truly naive teenager, and the first 12 or 13 years of my life were very sheltered. I grew up in a small-town community and attended schools with fewer than 100 students. We moved when I was about 14 to a larger urban area, and it was in that new home where I met the neighbor who would later become a troubling figure in my life. A question I didn't truly realize until recently, when I really thought about that time in my life, was that he had tried to groom me. I could have easily become his victim. It's been about 12 years since then, and only now do I fully understand what he was attempting to do when I was around 14. We had moved, packed up our things, and settled into a quiet neighborhood. I started attending the local school, and my mom had found a new job. She worked a lot, so she was often out of the house. I had an older brother, but he was around 20 and always partying or staying at friends' places, so I saw him even less. Then I saw my mom. I met the creepy neighbor the day after we moved in. He lived about 3 houses down from us. Since it was a sleepy cul-de-sac, he had seen the moving trucks and came over to introduce himself. He brought my mom a lasagna and asked if there was anything he could do to help. Normally, my mom was quite wary of new people. She had been hurt by users and abusers in the past, but she seemed surprisingly comfortable around him. He made her laugh and even helped us with some of the heavier furniture. He also gave her contacts for local plumbers and electricians in case we needed them, and he recommended the best internet providers in town. In short, he was friendly and helpful, going out of his way to make sure we were settled. At first, he kept to himself. We didn't see much of him for the first 3 months. If I happened to walk by and see him in his yard, I'd stop and say, "Hello." He'd ask me a lot of questions about school, my friends, which teachers I liked or disliked, my favorite subjects, and whether I did my homework. I didn't think much of it at the time. He just seemed like a polite and friendly neighbor. He eventually figured out my mom's work schedule, and since I was often home alone after school, he started to get bolder. One day I was walking home from volleyball practice. It was past 4, and the weather was hot. He was in his yard and called out to me, asking how practice went. Then he invited me inside for a glass of lemonade. I told him I needed to get home and start dinner so my mom would have something to eat when she got back in a few hours. He insisted it was just a glass of lemonade and that I had nothing to worry about. Long story short, most weeks after practice, I ended up having something to drink with him. He was easy to talk to and friendly, unlike any other adult in my life. Looking back, it was easy to connect with him because he didn't try to act too cool or authoritative. He seemed to genuinely respect my intelligence in a way no other adult did. He also started dropping by our house occasionally. If my mom got off work early or if it was her day off, he wouldn't come over. If my brother was home, he stayed away. But if it was evening and I was alone, he'd almost always stop by. He was a decent gardener, so he'd ask if I needed anything for dinner and often gave me tips or picked herbs from his garden for me. He'd also bring me flowers from his garden. Every time I thanked him, he'd say something like, "That's what friends are for," or "You deserve flowers. You've been working so hard at school." Once he even told me, "Beautiful flowers for a beautiful girl," and it made me blush. I'd thank him and put the flowers in a vase without thinking too much about it. Somehow he found out it was my birthday, and a couple of days later, when I was home alone again, he came over and gave me a silver bracelet. When I told him I couldn't accept it, he shushed me and said, "Don't overthink it." Then he told me it could be our little secret and that I could wear it when no one else was around. "It can be our fun little thing," he said. "You can always think of me when you wear it." Despite all the red flags, I didn't dwell on it. He was just a neighbor and a friend who looked out for me because he knew I was often home alone. He wanted me to believe I could trust him and see him as a protector I could turn to if I needed anything. Over time, I received a few more gifts from him, and each time he reminded me that it was our little secret and that no one else needed to know. "They wouldn't understand the dynamic of our friendship," he'd say. "You wouldn't want us both to get in trouble, would you?" And he was right, I didn't. Then one day, out of the blue, he hugged me. I had gone over to his house to help with some chores, and he pulled me into an embrace. I'm almost certain he sniffed my hair, though I can't fully remember. I do recall feeling like something was off. I was around 16 or 17 at the time, and we'd been friends for about 2 years. He tried to convince me to stay longer, but I insisted I had to go home. I ran the short distance back and must have looked shaken because my brother, who happened to be home, asked if something was wrong. I didn't tell him about the neighbor. Instead, I made up a story about some neighborhood kids being rude and bullying me. Luckily, a few times after that, my brother was around to keep an eye on me. He wouldn't let me leave the house without him, and I think he sensed my fear. The neighbors who saw us together must have noticed something was off, and my brother's presence made the neighbor back off. About 2 months later, we moved again. My mom had gotten a better job, and we were able to buy a nicer house in a better area. I shudder to think what might have happened if we hadn't moved. The thought of what could have occurred the day he hugged me makes me sick, and I feel nauseous remembering that I ate or drank anything he gave me. It could have been drugged. I can't believe I was so easily fooled and that I let someone do that to me. I'm truly grateful we moved away. When we moved into our new house, we were introduced to all of our neighbors as they came by with cookies or brownies, just like in the movies. It was a quiet, beautiful, middle-class neighborhood, made up mostly of older white couples and young families. Did I mention that we were the only black family in the neighborhood? No black wives, no black husbands, not even any adopted black children. It wasn't something we thought was particularly strange, but it was definitely noticeable. I was about 13 at the time, and my brother was 15. Our backyard was about half an acre and fenced in, but it was also connected to 2 other backyards, each about half the size of ours. A T-shaped fence separated our yard from the others. The house to the left belonged to an older man named Carl. He kind of reminded me of Willie Nelson, but without the nice braids. Carl loved being outside, often shirtless, and usually wore a denim tank top regardless of the weather. He was a pretty burly guy but looked somewhat frail. To us, he was the classic creepy old man. As I got older, Carl started making comments. I played in the backyard a lot with my dogs, and Carl could see me from his living room window. Every time I glanced over, he was always there, just standing at the window watching me. If he noticed that I saw him, he'd come outside and try to talk to me. I always tried to make it inside before he got out, but sometimes I wasn't quick enough. I didn't want to make it obvious that I was avoiding him, so I'd just walk inside at a normal pace. But if I didn't make it in time, he'd call out to me. I never got too close to the fence, but I'd answer him from a distance. He'd ask me about school, what grade I was in, and then tell me that I was pretty. He'd ask if I was old enough to have a boyfriend yet, or if I had any older sisters or friends who looked like me. It was weird, but I'd just laugh it off. Eventually, he'd stop talking and just stare at me in silence. I'd always find some excuse to go inside, and he'd just nod and stand by the fence watching me walk away. This happened almost every week. My mom loved decorating the house, so she changed up the decor every few months. At one point, she decided to install new sliding glass doors for the patio, which meant she had to remove the curtains in the living room. Since they were going to be down for a while, she didn't bother putting them back up. Our family TV was in the living room, and since I didn't have a TV in my room, I'd often stay up late watching shows there with my brother. One night, he went to bed early, so I was watching TV alone. Around midnight, I turned it off to go to bed. I stood up, turned off the lights, and when I turned back around, I saw another light, one that wasn't in my house. It was coming from Carl's house, from his living room window. He was standing there, just watching me. I told my parents about it, but they brushed it off. I was a naturally anxious kid, so I always assumed I was just overreacting. Not long after that, though, my dogs started getting sick. Every time I let them outside to play, they'd start vomiting or having diarrhea. We knew it wasn't their food since we hadn't changed their diet. We even threw out all the treats we had just in case, but it didn't stop. Then, I started noticing something strange. Whenever I let them out alone, they'd always run straight to Carl's fence, wagging their tails and jumping up and down. Carl would slowly come outside, reach over the fence, and feed them something. It was odd because Carl didn't even have a dog. I told my parents, and my dad went over to talk to him. Carl apologized and stopped giving them food, and after that, my dogs got better. A few weeks later, I came home from school. My brother was already in college, so I was usually home alone for a few hours. I had a routine. I'd drop my backpack, by the stairs, change clothes, let the dogs out from their kennel on the patio, grab a snack, then bring them back inside. But that day, for some reason, I was just too excited to see my dogs. So instead of going upstairs, I went straight to the patio. I had to open the door to let them out, and that's when I saw him. Carl was sitting on the ground right in front of their kennel. I froze. He hadn't seen me yet, but I looked over at the door to check if it was locked. It wasn't. I started moving as quietly as possible, but the door made a small noise. Carl looked up and saw me. I ran upstairs and tried calling my parents. My mom was a nurse and never had her phone on, and my dad rarely answered his. I didn't think it was serious enough to call the police, so I just hid. After a while, I heard knocking at the door. It wasn't loud or aggressive, almost friendly, like he just wanted to chat. I tried calling my dad again, and this time he picked up. I was sobbing as I told him that Carl was on the patio. He said he was on his way, but he was about an hour away. I just sat in my room, waiting. The knocking eventually stopped. All I remember is my dad coming home and Carl being gone. I don't know what happened between them, but Carl stopped coming outside to talk to me after that. He never stopped watching, though. He was always in his living room, standing by the window. Sometimes I'd see him through the glass and he'd wave at me, his light always on, just to let me know he was still there. It was terrifying. I'm a 21-year-old woman and I recently moved into my first apartment. My neighbors are all pretty nice, actually. I was introduced to them on the day I moved in, about 3 weeks ago. One of my neighbors is a guy named Mark. Mark is outside, most of the time, and he always wants to talk. Now, I'm not the most social person. I'm totally fine with chatting and having long conversations. But when I'm at home, I really just want to stay inside with my pets and watch the X-Files. Mark talks to me every chance he gets, like he's just waiting for an opportunity to say something. He even knocks on my door all the time to ask me random questions or invite me over to talk. For example, the week I moved in, Mark gave me his Wi-Fi password so I could use it for my TV. He asked for my phone number to send me a picture of his router, because the password was a random string of letters and numbers. I gave him my number and that was it. We never texted beyond that one exchange. Then today I suddenly got a bunch of messages saying I had a secret admirer who wanted to stay anonymous until we see where things go. At first, I ignored them until he used my name. Then he sent another message saying, "Talk to me, yes or no." At that point, I started panicking. I played along just to figure out who it was, keeping my replies short. He started asking about my interests, my type, and my age preferences. It felt really weird and uncomfortable because he completely refused to tell me who he was. Then, later in the conversation, he said we should have a secret relationship and not tell anyone. He also admitted he was in his 40s and said we should sleep together, adding that he would always support me financially. The only person in their 40s who has my phone number is my neighbor. And Mark is always outside, always talking to me whenever he gets the chance, always staring at me. I told him I was pretty sure I knew who he was, but he kept insisting that I didn't. It's way too much of a coincidence that I got those messages, barely 2 weeks after giving Mark my number. He tried saying he might have gotten it from a coworker, but I work in a hospital, and out of the 5 guys in my department, none of them have my number. So now I have a creepy neighbor who's been soliciting me for sex in exchange for money, and I'm basically stuck here on a 1-year lease, living just 10 feet away from him. Fantastic. When I was 11, almost 12, there was a woman who lived in the apartment above mine. She was known for selling cocaine. On the night of my 12th birthday, she disappeared. Not long before that, her boyfriend had come downstairs to ask if he could use our phone for her. This was in 2004, so having a cell phone was more of an exception than the norm, at least in my neighborhood. To give you some context, I was home alone at the time while my mom was at work, just about a 5-minute walk away. My mom had let the neighbor and her boyfriend use our phone several times before, so I didn't think anything of it and let him in. I led him to the living room at the front of our apartment so he could use the phone there. He picked up the receiver, dialed a number, waited a few seconds, and then hung up. He repeated this a few more times. Then, the front door of the building opened. Now, you could easily hear the front door open from where we were. It was a heavy door, and the walls were really thin. The way our building was set up, it used to be a small single-family home that had been converted into apartments. My mom and I lived in the only apartment on the first floor, and my upstairs neighbor's apartment was the only one above us. Not really relevant, but there was also a much smaller unit below us. After the door opened, my neighbor's boyfriend looked at me, put a finger to his lips as if telling me to be quiet, and then told me not to tell anyone he had been there. Then he quickly walked to my room, which was at the other end of the apartment. I stared at my bedroom door as it shut just seconds before there was a loud, police-style knock at the front door. My jaw dropped as I opened the door to see a police officer standing there. He looked nervous as he asked me if my neighbor's boyfriend was inside. I stammered, "Yes, he just went into my room." The officer asked if he could come in, and I nodded. As he stepped inside, he asked if I could open the back door for his partner and lead them to my room. We walked together toward the back of the apartment so I could unlock the door for his partner. The back door was right next to my bedroom door, but we had to go around the kitchen table to get there. Once they were inside, I watched as they pulled my neighbor's boyfriend out of my bedroom closet. As they escorted him out of my room and toward the back door, they told me to wait in the living room while they took him outside. I walked back to the living room, and after they closed the door, I couldn't make out what they were saying, but then I heard the unmistakable clinking of metal. I quickly realized he had just been handcuffed. Still shaken, I waited until the police car drove away before grabbing the keys, making sure the back door was locked, and locking the front door as well. Then, I left. I decided to go to my mom's workplace, now crying and overwhelmed with fear and adrenaline. That 5-minute walk took me about 2 minutes. I've never been a fast runner, but in that moment I was practically fueled by panic. I just needed my mom. When I told her what had happened, she was furious that he had used me the way he did, hiding in a child's bedroom closet and trying to evade the police. That night she gave me a short but firm lesson about not letting people in to use our phone. She told me I was no longer allowed to let anyone use it, even if I knew them, unless she was home. I never wanted to know exactly why he was wanted by the police, or what might have happened if they hadn't shown up.